Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called Unknown Humanoids, 10 Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Every single one of these cases involves very close-up encounters with humanoids of various kinds. I love the humanoid cases. We've got a lot to learn from them. They're super interesting. It's certainly the most popular subject on my channel. So these 10 cases I've chosen come from all over the world, including England, Italy, France, Spain, Poland, as well as Belarus, one from Argentina, and 3 from the United States, including Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and West Virginia. So some really interesting types of cases here, all different kinds of humanoids, short little dwarf-like beings, greys, robotic beings, tall beings, human-looking ETs, a full range of humanoid types, and of course supported by a wide variety of evidence, including not only multiple eyewitness testimonies, but of course landing traces, physiological effects, electromagnetic disturbances, animal reactions, the whole gamut that we see so often with these types of encounters. So all of these cases are super interesting and again I think have something to add to our knowledge of what's going on here. And the first case I'd like to talk about I call plant-picking ETs. I chose this case because it is quite unusual. It's a very early case, and it also is sort of typical of the patterns we see in so many of these cases with ETs coming down to apparently scientifically study our planet. It's also interesting because this case started with a very mysterious set of circumstances and events and culminated in a very close encounter with a landed UFO and quite unusual looking humanoids. This one occurred in July of 1954 in a rural area of the UK known as Cold Blow. This is outside of Temple Ewell in Kent, England. This case comes from UK researcher Chris Rolfe. The witness is Harold Carpenter. He's a woodcutter. And the weird events began early one morning around 4 a.m. in July of 1954 when Harold woke up in his home in Temple Ewell. This is a small community. He started hearing a strange, loud humming noise. It seemed to be coming from a nearby forested area, but it lasted only 2 or 3 minutes and then went away. But over the next few weeks, this humming noise occurred several times, waking him up usually between 4 and 5 a.m. and always coming from the same area. So one day, curiosity got the best of Harold, and he got up and followed this noise to a wooded area. It was still dark in these pre-dawn hours as he traced this noise to a clearing, and this is when he noticed a strange-looking round craft hovering about 8 to 10 feet off the ground. He said it was about 20 feet wide, but most shocking was that 5 very strange beings were standing underneath it. He said they were each about 4.5 to 5 feet tall, and carrying what looked to him like large jelly jars, in one hand. In the other hand, they were holding tweezer-like instruments, which they were using to sort of pick up twigs and leaves, which they put into their jars. Now, Harold did notice that none of them seemed to stray far from the craft, which was now hovering in complete silence, no longer making any humming noise. So he slowly crept closer, and as he did, he got a better look at these guys. He could see that each of them were wearing a one-piece flexible gray suit, which covered them pretty much from head to toe, covering everything except their faces. He says they looked very much human-like, had normal eyes, but their faces were strangely expressionless. And he also noticed that their noses stuck out, kind of like a pig's nose, he said. He also saw that they only had 4 fingers on each hand, seeming to lack a thumb. So he continued inching forward until he got real close, to within about 10 feet of this craft. And it was at this point that one of the beings looked up and stared at him, still totally expressionless. It didn't speak, it didn't make any noticeable movements to alert the other beings, But suddenly all of them immediately stopped what they were doing. The craft lowered to just a few inches above the ground, and one by one, these little humanoids walked up to the craft and stepped into the lip of the rim and went inside. The craft immediately began to rise. Harold actually saw one of the beings stepping inside an opening, the last one, which then closed. This craft rose up. It moved slightly towards a clearing among the trees, then gradually gained altitude and speed until it suddenly emitted a flash of light and took off with instant acceleration and was gone. Another amazing case, and yes, it does rest on one person's anecdotal eyewitness testimony, but certainly fits the pattern we see in so many cases. And the humanoids are quite unusual as well. I think it's an important case. And you can always discard one case, but there's another one where that came from, like this one, which I call something abnormal. This occurred in October of 1958 in Girona, Spain. I like this case because it started out with a simple sighting and could have ended there, but the witness decided to stop his car and walk out into the forest to investigate further, and this simple sighting turned into a very dramatic close-up encounter with a landed UFO and humanoids. It's also a super interesting case because his description of this craft is really unusual. This is a brief case and somewhat typical, if you can use that term, when describing an encounter with humanoids and a landed UFO. The witness is a gentleman by the name of Jose Luis Angelou. He had spent the day working, and around 7 p.m., again this is in October of 1958, he was driving his motorcycle between Saint-Jordi-de-Val and Cervia de Ter, again in Girona, Spain, and was heading west to his home. He was near the Ter River when he saw something abnormal happening in the sky, which actually prompted him to stop his car and observe. Coming out of the blue, he said, was a powerful white spotlight. It was approaching the forest near the road and descended at high speed, and when it reached the trees, the brilliant illumination from this object disappeared. But judging by its speed and sudden disappearance, Jose Luis assumed that the object must have been a burning plane that had crashed in the forest. But it was strange because he did not hear any noise, nor did he hear or see any evidence of a crash. So this made him even more curious. He got out of his car, walked into the forest to search for what he assumed would be the remains of some aircraft accident, because he had seen exactly where this object went down. And traveling there, he came upon something that left him absolutely astonished, because right in front of him, about 70 meters away, this is about 200 feet, was an oval object, metallic, with an appearance of aluminum, he said, about 8 meters tall, 2.5 meters wide, or 25 feet by 8 feet. He said it was hovering about 4 meters, 17 feet or so above the ground. It had a transparent dome on top with what looked like, quote, metallic nerves around it. So these weird sort of struts around the dome. He says light was coming out from the top of it. And he said the craft made a sound similar to a buzzing. It's almost as if there were nozzles that launched a very strong jet of air, he said. He said it also looked like it had small string-like things dangling down from the bottom, but he couldn't get a good look at them to see exactly what they were. But the most astonishing part was that just a short distance from the craft, he saw 2 humanoid beings. Now he couldn't see them that well, it was quite dark, but he did see that they had very large heads. They were about 1 meter tall, about 3 feet, dressed in dark suits that looked a little like leather or perhaps rubber. So he walked up as near to them as he dared, and he could see that they appeared to be collecting samples from the ground and were always staying quite close to the craft. A third being was actually looking out from the dome of the craft and watching the other 2. So he hid behind a tree, and even though he did that, the beings at one point did turn and look at him. Again, because of the darkness, he couldn't see their facial features, but they remained there watching him and still collecting samples for a full 15 minutes, says Jose. And then finally they returned back into the craft, which at this point made a loud buzzing sound, and it rose vertically. Once it reached a height of about 150 feet, it hovered there briefly. At this point, a metallic ring around the circumference emitted multicolored lights, and the object darted off instantly at very high speed to the northeast. It was now completely dark, so Jose did not check the ground where this craft had hovered, or these beings had walked around. Instead, he just returned home. He did say that the only real effect, other than the amazing sight of these beings, was that he was unable to sleep at all that night. So true, this is another case that rests on a single person's eyewitness testimony, but it was professionally researched by an experienced investigator, and I think it does add to our knowledge of what's going on here. There's so many cases like these, and here's another one which is really unusual. I call this one, I Want to Go for a Ride. This one occurred in July of 1963 in the Shumulinsko area of Vitebsk, Belarus. Don't get a whole lot of cases coming from this area, but I like this case because it is a multiple witness case. Really unusual humanoids, a very close-up encounter, and also it's interesting because in most cases the witnesses are quite frightened of what they're seeing. And that's true with some of the witnesses in this case, but one of the witnesses was very excited and actually went running towards the craft. So it's a pretty interesting case. This case comes from the Belarusian Ufological Committee and probably would have remained unknown by most of the world if not for Albert Rosales, who presented it in his books. Now, this is a very unusual case involving multiple witnesses. It was around noon as 13-year-old Maria Ivanovna was returning to her home near the railway station in the Shumulinsko district of Vitebsk. This is near the village of Mazarino in the Belarus area. And as she reached her home, she noticed that the sunlight seemed brighter than usual. And looking up, she saw two, quote, plates, discs, round and steel-colored like tinfoil. They were hovering in the sky. One object was quite high up and the other was much lower. Now at this moment, her 4-year-old brother Anton also saw these objects, and he started running towards the lower object. Actually ran right through a small stream, soaking his pants. Maria shouted at him, asking him where he was going and that he needed to put dry clothes on. By this point, the objects were descending to near ground level. And suddenly, this is when Maria noticed that Anton was getting very close to one of them. In fact, he shouted out at one of the objects, "I want to go for a ride." Maria wondered for a second who he was talking to, but realized he was shouting to this UFO. Now for her, this object was so bright she couldn't see inside it clearly, but as it came in for an apparent landing, apparently to intercept Anton, her little brother, who was still running towards it, Maria could now see that this object was actually disc-shaped with a transparent dome on top. It was quite small, no wider than 5 feet, she said. And inside this transparent dome, she could see a little man sitting in a metallic-looking chair. And this figure was not large. She says about the size of a 10-year-old child. He wore a steel-looking helmet, and she noticed, in fact, that this figure occupied almost the entire interior of this object. He appeared to be using his hands, which were below the transparent dome, not visible, to operate or maneuver this disc-shaped craft. Now Maria's little sister, Nadazda, she's age 10, quickly ran towards Anton at Maria's instructions, grabbed him by the arm, and pulled him away from this object. And Maria felt absolutely certain that if her other sister hadn't shown up, Anton would probably have been scooped up by this object. But now Anton was now in the safety of his sister, and this disc, apparently in reaction to this, quickly rose up to about 500 feet, and both of these objects promptly darted away at very high speed. I have to wonder what would have happened in that case if Anton's siblings hadn't intervened and pulled him away from this craft. It might have been an onboard encounter. Hard to say for sure, but certainly a compelling and important case, and interesting because of the area where it comes from. There's some really interesting elements to it. So many cases of these short little humanoids. I read a study once which showed that over 60% of reported humanoids are 4 feet and under. And we certainly see a lot of these short little humanoids. Now, let's move to this next case, which is unbelievably interesting. This actually involves a series of encounters, one of which is a very close-up and long-lasting encounter with a landed UFO and multiple humanoids. It's also a multiple witness case. This one occurred on September 15, 1967, in the small town of Winstead, Connecticut. Now, if this were the only case there, that would be super interesting, but it's not. There are a whole bunch of cases in this tiny little town. Very close encounters, a lot of witnesses. There's something really unusual going on in this town. All of the events in this case occurred very close to each other, all in this little town of Winstead, Connecticut. But the first big event was investigated by NICAP researcher Ted Thobin, and this occurred again on September 15, 1967, along a little road called Wallens Hill Road. You can see it here. It's just a small stretch of dirt road about a mile long. The two primary witnesses are 14-year-old girlfriends, Carol Luke and Ruth Passini. It was 8:45 in the evening, and they were looking out the second-story window of Carol's bedroom window when they noticed a glowing elliptical object. Not big, about the size of a small car, and it was moving back and forth at very low altitude over a field just south of their home. This was above and beyond the barn, which was about 50 feet away from their house. So this object appeared to be less than 200 feet beyond the barn, pretty close. They watched it for a full half hour as it moved up and down, left and right, pulsating in brightness. They had never heard of UFOs. They weren't sure what they were looking at. But this is when they suddenly heard this strange sort of put-put noise coming from the barn area. It sort of reminded them of a lawnmower that failed to start. And it was at this point that they saw two small figures run from the barn and stop by a mailbox right along Wallens Hill Road. These two beings appeared to be about 4 feet tall. They were wearing similar outfits. The girls couldn't see them very clearly because it was a cloudy night, but one of the girls was able to see that these figures had abnormally large heads, and they also appeared to be staring in the direction of their house. So after about 2 minutes of this, the figures darted across the road and stood under a large tree. Now Ruth and Carol are talking about what's going on here and trying to figure out who these figures might be. They wondered if they might be children, but decided that they couldn't be, as they didn't know of any other children in the area. And furthermore, the figures were not reacting to the presence of this object, which was still moving around back and forth. It would have been impossible not to see from that distance, they said. It gets even more interesting because at one point, a car started to come down the road approaching this area. Immediately, the two figures ran back across the street towards the barn again, where they were joined by a third figure. And at this point, all three ran across the lot alongside the barn and disappeared into the darkness. So as this approaching car arrived and passed by, the glowing object immediately extinguished itself. But when the car moved out of sight up the road, it lit up again pulsating, turning white and red, and continuing to maneuver around. By this point, almost an hour had passed, and Carol's mother, who had been out shopping, drove up to the house. Immediately, this object became dim again. The girls did alert Carol's mother about this object when she came inside. She saw it, but by this time it had moved off into the distance and was much dimmer. So she really wasn't super impressed by it, did nothing to investigate it. And this time, it was now 10 p.m., so both Carol and Ruth went to bed. But later, it was discovered that there was in fact another witness. the neighbor who lived right across the street, apparently a Miss Pascanini, she said that when she stepped out to bring in the laundry, she noticed a glowing watermelon-shaped object out in the field, exactly where the girls were seeing it. In fact, she watched it for a few moments, but becoming frightened by its unusual appearance, hurried back inside. And when later investigators asked her for more information, she became very tight-lipped. She refused to become involved. She wanted nothing to do with it. But later, 2 additional witnesses who lived less than 1 mile away said that at 7:50 p.m. on that night, they saw a glowing object, which they said was kind of shaped like a clam and was glowing bright red. So that's that case. But 2 nights later at 9:30 p.m., one of the girls and her mother had another sighting of a bright star-like object moving at about 25 degrees elevation across the sky, and suddenly it stopped, hovered in place just south of the house, remained motionless for several minutes. When a plane approached, this object returned back to the direction that it had come from and disappeared into the distance. And there were other sightings going on, because in fact, the day before this, which is one day after Carol and Ruth's sighting, at 7:45 p.m., September 16, 1978, Joan Ritchie and her 3 children, Scott, age 8, Billy, 7, and Barry, 6, were driving along Platte Hill Road. This is located on a hill that overlooks the town of Winstead. It's real close to this other case. And coming around a slight bend in the road, they came upon what looked to them like kind of a cone-shaped object sitting on the road about 300 feet in front of their car. It was quite large. It looked like it was almost as tall as the utility poles. And as Joan says, it was almost a triangle in shape, like a cone. It went up to a point with red lights about the sides and through the middle. Now, she had a hard time seeing any structure. She mostly saw lights. She immediately became frightened because even though she had her high beams on, all she could really see were these lights, which started about 1 foot above the road. This object, or lights, quickly moved away in a very smooth manner, totally silent. She quickly drove up to where this thing had been, but there was no longer any sign of it. And then came another dramatic sighting in Winstead only 4 days later. It was September 20, 1968, 10:30 p.m. Irene Pascoe went to check on her son Jack, who was in his bedroom, and this is when she noticed a sort of peachy pink glow outside his window in the woods next to their house. So she quickly woke her son Jack up and alerted him, and he looked out the window and said, "Mom, that's not a fire," because that's what she thought it was. So they looked at this strange glow that remained in the same place for quite some time, but nothing else happened. So Irene eventually returned to the living room to watch TV, still wondering if this might be a fire of some kind. A short time later, she returned to her son's room and saw that this strange glow had disappeared. Story's not over yet. 3 days later, a ranger arrived at the home. He expressed an interest in buying timber near their property. So Irene's husband, Charles, accompanied him into the woods to their property line. And this is when the ranger noticed a 35-foot-wide teardrop-shaped area of crushed, burned vegetation. And it turned out this was precisely where Irene and her son Jack had seen this strange peachy pink glow. Now, a closer inspection of this revealed 4 distinct triangular imprints in the soil. One was in the exact center, and the other 3 were arranged around it in an equilateral triangle with exactly 10 feet between them. The ranger, he said immediately that this looked like a UFO landing spot and that he himself and his brother had seen UFOs and other similar landing sites on previous occasions. So Winstead, something's going on there, I'm telling you. But hearing about this alleged landing site, 2 school teachers visited the area, And they noticed a few other things. Some of the tall trees surrounding the site were burned, scraped, and broken, and it looked to them as if an aerial object had come in for a diagonal landing. So the Winstead cases continued. This next case was investigated by Fawcett, David Webb, and Ted Blecher, and this occurred on February 21, 1968. The witness is a Miss Amato, age 12. We don't know her first name. But she was in her house in Winstead when she heard this weird bloop, bloop, bloop noise outside the window of her home. Turned out her bedroom overlooked an abandoned railroad station, which was being used as a storage site for ammonium nitrate fertilizer. And hovering close to the ground beside this building, she saw a white egg-shaped object about the size of a family station wagon. And as she watched, this craft emitted a short beam of light at a downward angle, much like a ramp, and then 15 or 20 little men, she said each about 3 feet tall, exited via this glowing ramp, walking in single file, jumped from the end of the beam to the ground. She said each of them was dressed in a dull silver jumpsuit and wore a fishbowl-type helmet. And she observed them as they proceeded to climb up the side of the building housing the fertilizer, one after another, using a hand-over-hand motion. It looked to her almost like they had suction cups on their hands, the way they were able to climb up this wall. Reaching the roof, they spread out in different directions, and these little men appeared to be looking down inside the building through a skylight. At this point, she became so frightened by what she was seeing, she went to bed and hid under the bed covers. But George Fawcett and the others were very impressed with their testimony, even more so because later that night there was yet another report, also in Winstead. It was 1 hour later, at 12:12 a.m., that Miss Cecilia Brewer and 5 of her companions were driving home from work between Winstead and Barkhamsted. And this is when their car engine started to fail. Looking ahead of them, they saw a silver-colored domed disc hovering alongside the left-hand side of the highway right over a forest clearing. Now they viewed this object from a distance of about 150 feet. They could see a cone of white light coming from the bottom down towards the ground. They said the dome of this object was lined with rectangularish windows, each of which emitted a green light. And they watched it for about 15 minutes, at which point it flew away. So quite a few cases. And here's a final and truly amazing Winstead encounter, which occurred 8 years after this flap of sightings. This one occurred on July 28, 1976 at Camp Delaware. This is a private summer camp located very near Winstead along Route 183. That afternoon, the camp counselor, a gentleman by the name of Ira Leifer, and 13 other boys, aged 13 to 15, all decided to take a hike up to the peak of nearby Blueberry Mountain, about 1,400 feet high. Among the boys were Kerry Ezrall, Greg Bond, Billy Weissman, and others. We don't know the names of the other children, but they had just reached the top of this little mountain. Some were standing and enjoying the view. Others were sitting down to rest, when without warning they all heard a high-pitched whining sound, which they said sounded a little bit like feedback from a speaker. And looking up all simultaneously, they saw a dome-shaped craft only 50 to 60 feet overhead. They estimated it was about 20 feet in diameter. They said it had a flat, shiny, reflective bottom. The top was dome-shaped, with a smaller dome on top which was eternally illuminated by a reddish light. It seemed to be rotating. Now, per Ira, the entire object itself was rotating. He could tell by the reflections on its surface. All of them said it was surrounded by a slight mist, and they all said it glowed sort of a purple-violet color. As soon as it was overhead, this whining sound stopped, and the object hovered in perfect silence for about 15 to 25 seconds. And as it was hovering there, the whole area around them became unnaturally quiet. Ira said that the object was your basic classic saucer, quote, like you see in the movies. It was really weird. He said that he and all the kids were, quote, dumbfounded, and that it was, quote, a very shocking experience. All the kids left descriptions of what they saw, which matched pretty much perfectly. This whining sound started again. The object darted vertically upwards at high speed and was gone. But this sighting caused a complete panic among this group. All of the boys fled down the mountain as fast as they could run, followed by Ira Leifer. They all ran into camp, breathless, excitingly discussing what they had just seen. As Ira said, it left and we ran. At first, everyone there agreed that they should keep their sighting secret. But pretty soon they were persuaded to call the police. Now, the police did not investigate, but did refer the case to both QFOS and APRO. And UFO researcher Paula Holmes of APRO showed up, was able to actually sneak into camp, interviewed Ira Leifer, talked with the boys. Alan Hendry of QFOS also did an investigation. And again, all the witnesses provided written statements about what they saw. All said pretty much exactly the same thing, with minor variations regarding the size of the craft, how high up it was, how long it stayed. For example, some said it was 15 seconds, others said it was 30. Some said the craft was 15 feet wide, others said it was 25 feet wide. So minor variations. They pretty much all agreed on the sound and the appearance of the craft, all agreed it departed at tremendous speed. As one witness said, I was still staring at the space, so I couldn't tell how it left. Another said it was, quote, faster than anything I had ever seen. So soon, word leaked out about this multi-witness sighting, and the story exploded into national headlines. Several articles were written in various newspapers. Now here's where it gets even more interesting, because later, the Evening Citizen newspaper received a handwritten letter saying, quote, we would like to confirm last week's sighting of a UFO as a hoax. Our group, along with the leader, wanted to see just how far a story would go. We fooled everyone. It now seems to be getting out of hand. So cool it now. This note was signed by initials TR, JT, MJ, and TM. But here's the problem with this, is that none of the witnesses had those initials. And none of the boys apparently said anything about this. So the hoax story itself was deemed to be a hoax. As Ira Leifer said, I know what I saw. He reiterated this when he heard about this letter coming to the newspaper. Now, Alan Hendry, regarding Kerry Ezrall and Greg Bond, he says, quote, I put it to them that we knew it was a hoax, and we only needed their verification of it. Both stuck to the original story and insisted that the sighting had really taken place. I couldn't budge them. Now, this was a private camp owned by Joseph and Ruth Weinstock, and they also agreed that this hoax accusation was not credible, as they said, quote, they did see what they saw. They swore by it. These boys swore that they saw it, and they ran like hell. I questioned them myself. So still rumors of a hoax continued to circulate. No landing traces were found. None of the witnesses were affected physically in any way. But hoax or not, there's a whole lot of cases going on in Winstead. Something very unusual is going on there. You have that many cases, that many witnesses. Even if one case should fall apart, there are so many others. It's very clear that UFOs are attracted to this tiny little town. I don't know why. I couldn't find anything particularly unusual about Winstead. It's just another small town in the United States. So I don't know what the draw is there for the ETs. Perhaps it's the people who are contactees. I don't know. But what an amazing series of encounters in a very sharply defined area over a very short period of time. Now let's move to the next case. Really compelling case, this one, which I call the Blue Ridge humanoid. This occurred on March 1st, 1974 in the unincorporated area of West Virginia called Vesta. It's quite an amazing case because it does have multiple witnesses. It's quite a long-lasting case. It has really well-verified landing trace cases and a very close-up encounter with this landed UFO and an unusually described humanoid figure. This case, which was investigated by researcher George Fawcett, he found it after it was written up in the local newspapers. And I said West Virginia, it's actually Virginia. Vesta, Virginia. This case begins at 8 p.m. on March 1st, 1974, when Billy Wayne Plasters, who was then 27 years old, had driven off his father's farm along Route 58 in this small unincorporated community of Vesta. This is in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and he was off to go visit the Vesta supply store. And this is when he noticed that, quote, the whole hillside was lit up. This was right near his father's farm. And as he said, it was, quote, not the color of firelight, but more like a bright yellow Coleman lantern. Now he kept driving, returned shortly later, and immediately alerted his brother-in-law, Richard Clifton, and his twin sister, Jane, who was married to Richard. All three of them watched this strange light from the windows of Richard's and Jane's home, and they were trying to figure out what it could possibly be when suddenly a reddish oval object described as, quote, bigger than a Volkswagen, rose up from the area of illumination to an altitude of about 300 feet, sending down a beam of white light from its bottom side as it rose up. It then stopped and hovered. It did a series of right-angle turns and headed towards the south. Much closer to all of this, to this glowing area, were Noel Castle, his wife Dorothy, and their daughter Frida. All of them also saw and heard this object. As Dorothy says, it made a shrill, penetrating sound. We were afraid to go outside to see what was causing all the commotion on John Plaster's farm. And as Billy Wayne Plaster says, quote, it looked like a huge round plate, fat in the middle and tapered at each end, was red and oval. We watched it until it got out of sight. His brother-in-law Richard Clifton said, quote, I saw something, but I don't know what it was, and I've never seen anything like it before or since. And Jane, his wife, said, it was like a science fiction story come true. Because of what happened next, although this UFO had left, the strange illumination on the nearby mountainside was still there. So Billy Wayne Plasters and his brother-in-law Richard Clifton decided to get a closer look. They hopped into their truck, drove across the highway, and right up to this illuminated area. They immediately noticed that all the farm animals there, which included 2 white horses, a brown steer, and 3 black calves, all of who normally came to greet them, were now nowhere to be found. They crept closer to the source of illumination, which they could now clearly see. Billy stood in front and Richard was right behind him, and this is when suddenly Bill saw a strange figure ahead of them, which he described as, quote, a big, tall, heavy-set man. Billy could see he was silhouetted on a nearby ridge in front of this glowing light. So he shouts out, who are you? What are you doing here? What's your name? There was no response other than this figure now started to advance towards the 2 men. At which point, Billy shouted out to Richard, something is coming at us. So they shouted out several times asking, who are you? Why are you here? What's your name? And so forth, but this figure did not respond, just kept walking towards them. Richard couldn't see the figure as well, but seeing Billy's fear, both men decided to run away. They ran towards their truck and got in. Now, meanwhile, Jane is watching from a small hill near the home, which afforded her a really good view of everything. And as Jane says, I watched the truck stop and its lights go out. It was awfully silent when suddenly I heard the truck door slam and the motor start up. When the men came back to the house, they looked like they had just seen a ghost. They were so white. So despite their fear, the men decided to return to the site. Only this time, they took their guns along with them. Going back, now armed, they returned to the spot, but when they arrived, the glowing object and the huge figure were both gone. But they did find a large burned area where this object had apparently sat right on the ground. They returned to the house and immediately called the Patrick County Sheriff Department and explained what they had just seen. They did not get the reception they had hoped for. In fact, the officers began to ridicule them over the phone, saying, "What have you folks been drinking up there? Are your eyes playing tricks on you?" In fact, the officer on the phone shouted out to his fellow officers, "What do you know? Some of the folks in the Vesta community have a flying saucer in their backyard." So needless to say, the police officers did not take this report seriously, did not investigate. But not to be put off, the witnesses decided to call the local newspaper, who put them in touch with researcher George Fawcett. George, his assistant investigator Mike Leonis, and news reporters very quickly arrived to investigate, spoke directly with the witnesses. They went to the site and they found that several hundreds of yards across the hillside and into the woods showed evidence of exposure to high heat. The ground, the ivy and laurel bushes, pine needles, woods and twigs, tree limbs, even fence posts were charred and blackened over a fairly wide area. There was an electric fence here, and it looked like that had somehow also burned. There was a prominent burn smell pervading the area. Soil samples were taken. They were tested for radiation, though none was found. But George Fawcett was convinced that the witnesses were telling the truth and calls this, quote, "an incredible sighting by credible multiple witnesses." And as Billy Wayne Plaster says, "I don't know what I seen, but I sure seen something." How about that? Can you imagine calling the police, being that traumatized by your encounter, and what do? Laugh at you and ridicule you? Such a shame. This subject should be treated much more seriously than it is because so many people are having encounters, and these witnesses are clearly very sincere. It's a great case with landing trace cases and also professionally researched by an experienced investigator. So an important case, I think, on many levels. Now we move to the next one, which I call the shiny silver Seawickly humanoid. This case occurred on March 23rd, 1974 in Seawickly, Pennsylvania, and it involves a gentleman who had a very close encounter with quite an unusual humanoid. But what's amazing about this case is, yeah, it's a single witness case, but it does have some landing traces in the form of footprints, and it's also supported by a huge number of encounters occurring in that general area very close to the same time. So this is what we would call a wave or a flap of sightings, which involve quite a variety of types of encounters, with simple sightings and cars being chased down the road, electromagnetic evidence, physiological effects, and of course a humanoid. This humanoid encounter was preceded by a flurry of UFO encounters all across Pennsylvania, most of which were researched by investigator Stan Gordon. It was on the night of January 27, 1974, when an anonymous female was driving near Irwin. This is about 33 miles away from Seawickly, where later there would be a humanoid encounter. And this is when she saw two bright lights in the sky like car headlights. They disappeared, but abruptly reappeared, only now they were at very low altitude, much closer to her. In fact, she could see a dark shape covered with lights, and this object began to pace her car, and then very suddenly flew quite close to the vehicle, actually causing her car engine to lose power. It finally flew off, leaving her hysterical with fear. It was the next day, January 28, 1974, 10:30 p.m., when two women in Seawickly saw a very large silver cigar-shaped object which suddenly dropped to about 150 feet, right above the trees. They said it had bright red and white lights in front, a white light in the rear, and that was pretty much it. But events were still in progress. It was just over a week later, on February 7, 1974, a man was driving along Route 982 near Laurelville. This is about 60 miles from Sewickley. And this is when he saw a 30-foot wide disc. He said it was flying about 150 feet high and was only 100 feet from his car. He said it was solid white on top, but had red, green, and blue lights on the bottom. He could hear it making a humming noise. And he said he also smelled a strong sort of chemical odor. And the encounters continued, because it was the next month at 8:30 p.m., March 18, 1974, at West Newton. This is about 36 miles from Sewickley and 13 miles from Irwin. A man was driving along a remote highway when he saw a cluster of lights that appeared to be attached to an object, when suddenly it swooped down right towards him. He said it came only feet from his car. This point, his car radio immediately filled with static. His headlights dimmed, his amp meter showed that his battery had actually discharged, and the object flew off. But the witness says at this point he became suddenly and abnormally incredibly drowsy, to the point that he could barely keep from falling asleep, and he did in fact hit the guardrail alongside the road with his car. That same night, a doctor and his family in the area also saw a disc-shaped object glowing first red, then gray, then blue-green as it darted back and forth across the sky several times. And events came to a climax less than 1 week later. This was at 12:55 on March 23, 1974, when 2 officers for the State Game Commission were patrolling the Hanover area. This is some distance, about 200 miles from Sewickley, when they saw a glowing cigar-shaped object which they said, quote, was like a giant fuselage. It was very close to them, about 900 feet from their car. They said it was probably about 6 times the length of their own car, silent, and was emitting a pulsating light towards the ground. Now that was their encounter, but it was just 7 hours earlier in Sewickley that an anonymous 16-year-old teenager reported his encounter with a very unusual humanoid. It was 6 p.m. He was riding his motorcycle in his favorite spot. This is a 1,000-acre area of woods and hilly terrain southeast of his home in Sewickley. He had climbed up a hill on his motorbike, rode around there for some time, and then was gliding quietly down the hill. This is an important detail because he feels like because his bike wasn't making a whole lot of noise, he may have surprised this being that he saw. Because reaching the base of this hill, he comes around a corner, still coasting, and this is when he saw a figure standing in profile, facing up the hill, only about 750 feet away. He revved up his motorcycle and switched gears, which apparently caught the attention of this figure as it immediately changed from a side position, turned and faced the witness, then started to squat down on the ground. Now this did allow the witness to get actually a good view of this being, and he said that this figure was humanoid in form, but was at least 7 feet tall, perhaps taller, and was completely covered in a wrinkly, shiny, stainless steel-colored bodysuit from head to toe. This includes his face. The only part that wasn't wrinkly was the head. He said it had a football-shaped head, but yeah, still covered with this silvery covering, only it was skin-tight and smooth. So after remaining in a half-squat position for a few seconds, this figure turned towards the hill, took 3 large steps, and vanished into the forest. Now, this witness did not see any UFO or any object, just the humanoid. But after interviewing the witness, researchers returned to the area, and they believe they did find footprints. In fact, as Stan Gordon says, investigators who searched the area found some possible footprints of the creature. In the same spot where it was seen climbing up the hill into the woods, 3 impressions were found that were dug into the terrain and went straight up. Most humans climbing such a hilly area would angle their feet to obtain a better balance. Big thanks to Stan Gordon for investigating all these events. He's one of the few researchers out there who I really trust and admire. I think he's a great researcher who's worked really hard to just present the facts, put out the information, verify it to the extent that we can. And what an amazing series of events. It always makes me wonder, when a person sees a UFO, is this someone else's close encounter of the third kind, where they're seeing a humanoid or even being taken on board? I think so. All right, let's move to another case. This one is really unusual. I call this the sweet-smelling alien. It occurred on June 25, 1974 in Viorba, Italy. And this is a single witness case, though it does have some interesting details to it. It's got animal reactions. To me, the most interesting and compelling part of this case is the witness's description of an unusual sweet-smelling odor which he associated with this encounter. A really compelling case on multiple levels. This case comes from researcher Roberto Pennati of CUN, the Centro Ufologico Nazionale Group, and this case appeared in his book UFO Contacts in Italy, and it was also published widely in other magazines. The witness is known only by his initials, DP. It was around 3 a.m. on June 25, 1974, when the witness woke up, went down to the kitchen to get a drink of water, and this is when he heard footsteps coming from the courtyard outside his home. Curious who it might be, he turned on the outside light and peered outside. A slight drizzle of rain was falling, and he didn't see anybody, but he did notice a couple of unusual details. As he says, first, the house cat was planted in the middle of the courtyard, clearly in a defensive position, with his eyes fixed towards the road that runs alongside the house. He had unruly hair and a bushy tail. Second, a strong, sweetish smell. He smelled something sweet. So he was very curious about this. He went back inside, retrieved a flashlight. Going back outside, he began to walk along the road next to the house. This road was lined with a hedge of acacia. Now the cat was still all riled up. He wondered if perhaps it was upset at the neighbor's dog, but still he didn't see anything out of the ordinary. And he was about to go back inside when, as he says, quote, I had the sensation of a physical presence. So he turned, and to his shock, he saw a glowing white figure. He said it was covered in this sort of shiny, skin-tight jumpsuit. He said the shine may have been because the suit could have been wet from the rain, but most alarming was that this figure was, as he says, quote, staring at me, or so it seemed to me, through two small slits located where the eyes are normally found in a man. So this figure was quite unusual looking. It shocked the witness. He automatically stepped back, and he began to feel a real sense of fear, and became even more alarmed when this figure did something totally unexpected. As he says, the strange figure slowly rose from the ground, almost perpendicularly, as if he were on an escalator, presenting himself in profile until he passed the acacias about 10 meters high. And off he went and disappeared. There was no noise. The witness did not notice any unusual lights or objects as this figure disappeared into the night. He went back into his house, was quite confused and puzzled by the whole event, tried to come up with a logical explanation for what he had seen. But there was none. He says he ended up getting no sleep that night. He did notice that his cat disappeared for 3 full days, as did the neighbor's dog. He did look around for landing traces or any evidence, didn't find any, but he says that he himself suffered from, quote, a severe migraine for about 1 week following this incident. He never did find any explanation for what he saw, and wonders if whoever or whatever it was might have been some sort of projection of some kind. He's open to interpretation, but definitely agrees it was quite strange. So there you go. One more case to add to our knowledge of what's going on here. A case with animal reactions, physiological effects, some really unusual details. You can only imagine what it must be like to walk up to a figure that you can't identify who is clearly not quite human and then floats off into the sky and over a tree. I don't know. Can't blame the witness for really freaking out about his encounter. Now I move to another one. This one is really interesting because this witness was very close to this really unusual humanoid. I mean, only feet away. I call this one the E.T. with the flashing eyes. And I can't say I've ever heard a case quite like this. It's got really remarkable similarities to a lot of other cases, and also some unique details as well. This occurred in July of 1975 in Saint-Dizier, France, and I think you'll agree this is a case that deserves to be widely known. It was around 9 p.m. one evening towards the end of July 1975 when Madame Carmen B., we don't know her last name, decided to take advantage of the warm temperature and hang out her laundry in the backyard. This is in the Lannion district of Saint-Dizier, France. As she did so, a sudden, brilliant, white circular light illuminated almost her entire backyard. So Carmen stood in the center of the illumination and was awestruck by its incredible brilliance. She also noticed that all the noises around her had suddenly stopped. And this light, she said, looked like a very compact circular wall, totally opaque, blocking the view of her house behind it. So this is not normal light. Strangely, despite its brilliance, it did not cast any shadows. So Carmen at this point realized she was paralyzed, unable to move. At the same moment, although there was no noise, she had the distinct feeling that somebody or something was standing very close behind her. And although she felt unable to move, she was somehow able to look to her side. And she was amazed to see a 3-foot-tall humanoid figure standing only 50 centimeters, this is less than 2 feet, away from her. She said it was well proportioned. Its arms were a little longer than normal, the head definitely larger than normal and kind of egg-shaped. It wore a light khaki-colored one-piece uniform. This covered the entire body. It came over the head like a hood, she said, but she was most impressed by this being's strange eyes. These eyes had no irises, no eyelashes, no eyebrows. They were very bright yellow, and in fact they seemed to be emitting flashes of light, sparks of light. She said they were so large they covered almost the entire face. And this being was staring at her with this incredibly hypnotic gaze, never once blinking. At this point she's on the verge of total panic. She kind of felt like this being was exerting some kind of power over her with its hypnotic eyes. And standing there under its intense gaze, she felt like she was about to have a nervous breakdown, but did finally manage to break free of this trance, of this paralysis, and ran back into the house, taking refuge in the kitchen. But to do this, she had to walk right through this opaque wall of light, which she did, and she said it had no effect whatsoever on her body that she could tell. But now in the house, trembling and thoroughly frightened, she immediately sought out her husband, quickly told him what happened. He immediately went out into the backyard, but of course the light and the humanoid were gone. The next day they looked around. Carmen discovered that the electric lamp she had left on a bench near this place where this little being had stood was now missing. She did ask her neighbors. A few days later, none of them had seen anything unusual. However, in the days that followed, her neighbor's house mysteriously did catch fire. An investigation by firefighters failed to reveal a cause. Hard to say if there's any connection to Carmen's experience, perhaps not, but it was an unusual event right after a very unusual event. One more amazing case of a humanoid, adding up with all the other incredible cases, which make it so clear that we are not alone on this planet. We are being visited, and you can interpret these events however you want. I personally do think the vast majority of these are extraterrestrials in the classic sense, but certainly not all of them. I think there's a lot of stuff going on here, and some of this stuff gets put under the UFO umbrella, the ET explanation, that perhaps has other explanations. But you can make up your own mind about it. I'm just presenting the facts as we know them. And here's another case, which I call the ETs in the forest. This is a multiple witness case, also does have landing traces. And what I like about this case is the ETs are quite unusual. The witnesses saw them very close up. This occurred on February 19, 1984 in the Tuchola Forest. This is in the Linołek area of Poland. It's a professionally investigated case, and also, thank goodness, the researchers had the witnesses all produce drawings of what they saw, which I think really adds to being able to visualize what exactly happened. We don't know a whole lot about this case, but it was investigated by several researchers, primarily by Arkadiusz Arek Miazga. It was around 2 p.m., again on February 19, 1984, as a group of young children, age 5 all the way up to 10, were playing in a meadow in the Tuchola Forest. This is in Osieczna Linołek in Poland. So the children were slipping and sliding around on the ice, this was in February, when a strange-looking figure appeared. They said it was black, had a roundish head. Frightened, they ran away. And this is when they saw a dark, oval, egg-shaped object appear overhead. It quickly lowered to the ground, extended a sort of ladder-like device, and coming down was a metallic-looking figure, very short, less than 4 feet tall, and it immediately began to walk towards them, just a short distance. The kids were running away, and this being returned to the craft, went inside, and the craft moved along the edge of the forest, then disappeared. But following the event, researchers Andres Remlin and K. Pichota did record an interview with the witnesses, had them produce drawings of what they saw, took photographs. Unfortunately, the recorded interviews were lost, only the drawings and the pictures remain. But one of the witnesses, a Ms. Dorota, was contacted by researcher Arek many years later, and she said, quote, "It wasn't a lie. That day my brother and I went to the forest with a friend when we suddenly saw this strange figure. As children, we got scared and ran home, but at home they thought it was a child's invention. It was so terrifying for us that we didn't go back there for a long time. I don't remember many details from that day, because as I wrote, I was only 10 years old, and no one believed us, so we also tried to forget." But the researcher Arek Miazga is convinced it's a real case. In fact, as he says, "Since I was there about 1 hour after the event, I went with the children to see if there were any traces. There was snow, there were precise traces of the children running away. Apart from that, nothing. I am not gullible, but I believe these children." Another amazing case. And yes, although it is a multiple witness case, these are very young children. And some might argue that children aren't particularly reliable. And I think it's true that they might be given to an active imagination and perhaps aren't the best witnesses in some ways. But I think actually, on the other hand, they make really good witnesses because they don't overlay their own interpretation of these events. Most of them have never heard of UFOs. They're like sponges, able to absorb knowledge in a really remarkable way. And as we've seen, the investigators contacted a couple of these witnesses years later, and they still remembered him. This is something that impresses a person, in most cases, for the rest of their lives. It's a super amazing case. And now we move to another one. This is probably my favorite of the bunch. It's such a poignant and emotional case involving a gentleman who had a very close encounter while driving on a lonely highway at night. So many cases like this. I call this one the interrupted journey. It occurred on August 25, 1999 in Trenque-Lauquen, Argentina. And of all the cases, this is probably the most famous. It's certainly pretty well known in Argentina. But to me, what's most compelling about this case are not the electromagnetic effects, which are quite prominent, but really the psychic after effects with the witness, which were really pronounced and so unusual. And while it is a single witness case, these after effects from the witness were observed by many people around him. And it was clear that this encounter affected this man for the rest of his life. It's such an important case. It was 4:30 p.m. as car mechanic and owner of a very successful machine shop, Carlos Colon, who you can see here, he's an upstanding and highly respected member of his community. He was driving his 1998 Chevy pickup along National Route number 5. Again, this is August 25, 1999. His car is pretty much brand new. He had reached kilometer marker 465 when his truck radio began to make a strange buzzing noise. Now, he was charging his cell phone at the time and thought perhaps it might be malfunctioning, but when the buzzing sound became intense to the point of becoming almost deafening, he realized something else was going on. In fact, he said it sounded like, quote, 1,000 mosquitoes buzzing in your ear. He wondered if perhaps his truck alternator had broken, which again really angered him as this truck was only 1 year old. He began swearing. He tried changing the radio stations, but that didn't work either. And this is when he noticed movement up ahead, slightly to the right, and looking in that direction, he saw an unidentified, quote, something, and it was zooming towards him at very high speed. Next thing Carlos knew, his truck stopped. He got out of his truck, and this is when he saw the silhouettes of 5 white figures standing in front of him on the road. He could see that they were 2.5 meters in height. This is over 7 feet tall. And they seemed to be standing inside some kind of circular screen. He said it looked almost like a globe of frosted glass. They were standing side by side, legs spread, arms by their side, and actually seemed to be floating slightly above the ground and sliding around inside this dome, this globe. They did move their heads slightly, appearing to look at each other, but then looked directly at Carlos. It was real shocking to him because he could not see any faces. There was just a dark oval where the face should be. He said they were all dressed in white. They appeared to have helmets with a dark visor obscuring the face. Kind of reminded him of diving suits. But then they did something even stranger. They appeared to grab each other's hands, forming a kind of circle with their heads facing inside this dome, this screen, almost touching each other. The screen-like thing appeared to shrink into a cone or a bell-like shape, became dark gray. A dark mist obscured the object, and suddenly everything disappeared. As Carlos said, it was, quote, just like turning off a television set. He looked around him, but the strange humanoids were gone. However, he did notice several concerning details. His truck was now facing the opposite direction. He had been standing outside of his truck, but now he found himself standing in the middle of the field alongside the road, and he could hear the radio in the truck playing loudly. So needless to say, this quite frightened him. He ran back to his truck, jumped inside almost in a trance, drove at high speed down the highway towards Trenque-Lauquen. The whole event, he estimated, lasted about 2 to 7 minutes. He's really not sure. But as he passed the village of Lasagna, he seemed to, quote, snap out of his trance. And he was surprised to see how fast he was driving. He says he then felt a wave of incredible tiredness, fatigue. He thought he might be having a blood pressure attack. He suffered from low blood pressure. But later, visiting his doctor said, no, you just have nervous tension. He did have some dizziness and blurred vision. However, he found that his problems with blood pressure had disappeared and never returned. So this appears to be a healing of some kind. He did return to the site a few days later, was quite surprised to find some of his paperwork lying on the ground at the site. He found his own footprints, but no evidence at all of the humanoids or this thing, craft, that they were in. But he did learn that another trucker and his companion had seen several luminous objects crossing over the highway near the village of Lasagna on the night of his encounter. But it was what happened afterwards that really changed everything. This encounter changed his life. In the days, weeks, and years following his encounter, everything changed profoundly for him, in many ways. He says electrical equipment began to malfunction in his presence, which is hard for a mechanic, including watches and TVs and more. He found that he had a near eidetic photographic memory. He began experiencing precognition, all kinds of weird psychic abilities. Probably the strangest was one day his wife woke up to see Carlos wandering around the house, apparently sleepwalking. But his body was glowing with white light. Carlos never felt normal again. He says all of this was quite stressful, and this psychic abilities, these paranormal events, continued to plague him till the day he died. Amazing. And we see that pattern in case after case of someone who has a very close encounter and suddenly their psychic abilities are awakened to a remarkable degree. And that's clearly what's going on in this case. I suspect it probably is a full-blown onboard experience. Hard to say for sure because he can't say that he did have missing time. But given the fact that he sort of blacked out and woke up outside of his car out in the field when he was standing next to his car by the road at one point and doesn't know how he got out in the field. That's a pretty big red flag that there's more to this encounter than he remembers. What an amazing case. So there you go, 10 cases from all over the world involving a wide variety of humanoids. Many of them multiple witness cases, many of them just one event surrounded by a sort of conglomerate of events, and all of them contributing to our knowledge of what's going on here. So many different types of humanoids, so many different people having these encounters, occurring for such a long time. I just don't see how anyone can remain skeptical of this subject. It's my belief that people who are skeptical simply haven't done their homework and looked at the huge number of cases going on here. Any explanations such as hoaxes, hallucinations, misperceptions, and mental illness just don't hold water. This is why I do this research. We need to stop this ridiculous government cover-up and accept the fact that we are not alone in this universe. So thanks very much for watching. I truly appreciate it. Hope you found it interesting and informative. And until next week, thank you very much. Keep asking those important questions. Keep searching for the truth. And most important of all, keep having fun. I'll see you guys next Friday. Bye for now.